Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by Registered Dietitian Nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. This is a 3-part series on umami and MSG, or monosodium glutamate. I'm interviewing 4 different experts on the history, the science, and the culinary applications of MSG and umami. Now, MSG is one of the most beloved and demonized ingredients in American history. It's a staple for home cooks and world-renowned chefs, yet it's a subject of skepticism as brands and restaurants promote quote-unquote MSG-free foods and dishes. Back in September, I was invited to attend the World Umami Forum in New York City, an event hosted by Ajinomoto, the world's first and leading manufacturer of MSG. What I learned there was so compelling that I decided to do a series of episodes so that I could interview several of the speakers and experts that I met at the conference and bring their knowledge and their stories to you. You'll hear from a food historian and author, a registered dietitian, a research and food industry scientist, and also a chef. Now, in this series, we explore the largely untold history, the research on the safety, the culinary applications, and even some potential health benefits and current research approaches. And what you learn may surprise you. There's quite a story to be told here. Now, while we are going to explore these topics in depth, I want to share some top-line information with you now. First, MSG, or monosodium glutamate, is a seasoning that combines sodium with glutamate, which is an amino acid that is naturally present in certain foods. 2, MSG is the purest form of umami, which is one of the 5 tastes, in addition to sweet, salty, sour, and bitter, and it brings out the savory flavor in foods. And 3, replacing 1/3 of the table salt in a recipe with MSG can reduce the sodium by up to 40%. In fact, the Institute of Medicine has referenced the potential of MSG as a tool to reduce sodium in foods. So in these 3 episodes and 4 interviews, we cover a great deal of information. However, we did not discuss where you can purchase MSG. So I want you to know that it's sold under the brand name Accent in the United States, as well as Ajinomoto, and can be purchased in the spice aisle of most major supermarkets, also Asian grocery stores, and of course, online. I want to thank Ajinomoto for inviting me to the World Umami Forum and for their support and sponsorship of this podcast series. I hope you enjoy listening and learning all about MSG and umami. For more information and resources, you can visit my show notes at soundbitesrd.com and also the website whyusemsg.com. Enjoy the series. Hello, and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. You know who I am, and you know what I stand for. Thank you for tuning in. This is a 3-part series on umami and MSG, or monosodium glutamate. And today's guest is Mary Lee Chin. She is a registered dietitian with a master's degree in science, and she speaks out on some of the most provocative and controversial topics of today, including genetically modified foods, environmental and ag sustainability issues, and MSG. Through her company, Nutrition Edge Communications, she advocates moving from polarizing rhetoric to open and professional, courteous discourse. And as a friend of hers, I have to say she does a phenomenal job of that, and we could all learn from her. Mary has been a dietitian for over 40 years, and she formerly held a 6-year term as a spokesperson for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. Welcome to the show, Mary.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I'm very happy to be here to talk about this topic today, especially because it is so closely tied with my Chinese and Asian heritage.
Absolutely. You're a perfect person to address some of the issues that we're going to get into today. And, I have to say, because I often say with my guests, how we met and how we know each other. And I don't know if I remember the very first time we met, but I've known you for years and I've seen you at conferences. I've seen you present, and we've had many, many fascinating conversations, whether we're riding the bus somewhere or we're sitting next to each other at lunch during a conference. I love talking with you and learning more about your work and your background. And we also, I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago, we had the most fun visit to Graceland. Remember that?
Yes, Elvis forever.
It was one of those situations where we were on a rice tour, and for whatever reason, we both had enough time to fit that little visit into Graceland before we caught our flights. And we were both like, do you want to go? I want to go. Let's go. And it was so much fun seeing it with you. And we both sort of had the same reaction to it. It was very moving. And it was just such a pleasure, like having that experience with you.
Well, I have always enjoyed talking with you, and talk is the key word here because we have just had these incredible conversations. And I have to let your listeners know, I've known Melissa since she was a baby dietitian, and to see what she's doing now is just phenomenal.
Oh, thank you. You're sweet. Well, let's dive into today's topic. I attended the World Umami Forum in New York City last fall. And, I went in pretty open-minded, as I usually do. I knew that there was a lot I didn't know about MSG. I had done a little bit of research and I'd written some blogs on the topic for IFIC, the International Food Information Council. But I, certainly wouldn't say I'm an expert in the area. And I was really impressed with the entire conference. And that is what led to this 3-part series where I'm interviewing 4 different people who are sharing different perspectives and insights on the topic. But it was just an outstanding conference. And you were one of the speakers and on a panel there. Having known you, and I've been wanting to have you on the show for a long time anyway, this was just a perfect opportunity. So do you want to tell us maybe a little bit about any disclosures that you have or any companies that you work with? For our listeners, it's nice to kind of hear that perspective of, what types of companies, what your role might be, and the different interests that you have.
Sure. And the MSG component of it is something that I am really interested in. And so, as a registered dietitian, I've been very happily working with Ajinomoto, which is the food producer from Japan, and they make MSG. So, as a consultant for them for over 20 years, I find it a phenomenal company to do work with, and it fits my interest as a dietitian about food, good food, and flavorful food, because that's such an important component in getting people to eat well, healthy, and nutritiously. Because we can, as dietitians, make recommendations of all kinds of food, but if it doesn't taste good, we're not going to do as great of a job persuading people to a healthier diet. Some of the other work I've done has been with the Nutrition Seminars program, which is with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. And also, I do consulting work with Bayer Ag Sciences, formerly known as Monsanto. I also work with other commodity groups and nonprofits. I'm very aware that it's important that people understand where their food comes from, how it's grown, and when we put it on the plate, will they eat it? And so the consulting work I do with all these companies really just feed into my interest in talking about food and nutrition.
Excellent. I agree wholeheartedly. As a dietitian for 25 years, I think a lot of times, we focus on the science, we focus on the education, we focus on the smart nutrition tips, but we can't forget the good food, the enjoy food, the savor food aspect of it. And so we are going to dive into MSG and how it flavors food, but a lot of other topics. I think the best place to start is kind of looking at the background. So you've been working with Ajinomoto for 20 years, and I'm sure over that time, what I learned at the conference is that there's been quite a history and evolution of the company and producing and manufacturing MSG. So let's start with maybe your background with your culture, heritage, and I've heard you talk about this before, and I've seen you write about it as well, and I think it's a good place to set the stage.
Well, thank you. And the circumstances of how I got into the whole area of food and nutrition really is based on my parents and where they came from. My dad came to the United States as a poor immigrant at the age of 14 by himself. So he spent the following decades working as a domestic, a laundryman. He had a visit back to China for an arranged marriage with my mom, and they were married for 74 years. Dad served as a GI in the U.S. Army. And as a result of his service, he was able to bring my mother and brother over from China because of the laws back then. It was very difficult for Chinese immigrants to come into the United States. So, for my mom, who also came from a very poor background, just being faced with the variety and the access to more quality food, she was able to prepare better meals. Though, as a family, we owned a laundry, and you didn't make a huge amount of money doing that. So, we were pretty food insecure. So mom used the sauces and condiments that she was very familiar with, which also, by the way, were very rich in umami flavors, to produce the foods that she was familiar with and to produce very good tasting food from the little that we had. When I went to college, I decided to major in food and nutrition because when you're food insecure, you always have a focus on food.
Mm-hmm.
And what I tell people, and I'm very fond of saying, that just as salt, pepper, and ketchup are typically found in Western kitchens, in my mom's kitchen, bottles of soy sauce and oyster sauce and brown bean sauce with garlic were staples in our kitchen as well. So my interest in food and nutrition does come from the circumstances of growing up as food insecure and then learning from my mom and dad how to make the little food that we had taste really, really good.
I can relate a little bit. I don't have a Chinese background, but I was on food stamps as a young child, and that may have played a role in me becoming a dietitian. Yeah, you definitely have that extra focus on food, and I've heard that from other colleagues as well. Let's touch base briefly about MSG and umami. Explain to our listeners the connection there.
MSG was discovered over 100 years ago in Japan. And this was a scientific researcher who ate a bowl of his wife's broth and found it so delicious. And he asked his wife, "How did you produce this?" And she indicated it was from dried seaweed. And as a scientist, it piqued his curiosity. And in his research, he found the compound which was in seaweed that gave its delicious taste. And it was glutamate or glutamic acid. Glutamic acid is one of the 20 amino acids that is pervasive in humans, found in the protein part. When glutamic acid in food is broken down by cooking or fermentation, it produces glutamate. This substance, glutamate, is the same found naturally in foods and makes up MSG. So when one sprinkles MSG on food, you get glutamate, the same substance that's found in food that gives its delicious flavor. And so MSG crystals are used to enhance the flavor of food. And that's the connection with a little bit of history there between glutamate and MSG.
Okay, great. And umami is one of the 5 tastes. So we've got sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. And a lot of people may have heard the term, but don't really know what it is. We're going to talk more as we go through about MSG, monosodium glutamate, glutamic acid, all of that. But I wanted to just kind of make that connection before we delve further.
Right. Well, and I think one of the things is that it can be a little difficult to describe what is the flavor of umami. So the glutamate, which produces the umami flavor, has been described as savory, meaty, or broth-like. So when you think of eating something like mushrooms or dried tomatoes or meat, that very rich, savory taste is what we identify as the taste of umami.
Thank you. So let's talk now about this Chinese restaurant syndrome, because even though MSG has been used for decades and really was something that was desired in, cooking, and not just from a cultural heritage standpoint, but in the US. And then all of a sudden, there were some fears. There was this Chinese restaurant syndrome that people were talking about, and MSG is bad for you. So can you set the stage with the history on that?
Surely. The question pops up from one of the famous food writers in the United States, and he was a food critic at Vogue magazine. And his question was, if MSG is so bad for you, why doesn't everyone in China have a headache? And as a daughter of Chinese immigrants and the sister of a retired Chinese restaurant owner, I asked my own question, which is, why is it called Chinese restaurant syndrome when the product was originally discovered in Japan? And that goes back to a letter that was published in 1968 in the New England Journal of Medicine. And it was from a Dr. Robert Ho Man Kwok, ironically a Chinese immigrant himself. And he wrote, it wasn't a scientific letter, it was a pretty chatty little letter and article where he mentioned that he had felt weakness and headaches and radiating pain in his arms after eating in a Chinese restaurant. And he postulated that it might have been caused by the wine or maybe too much sodium or perhaps MSG. Well, the letter was published in the New England Journal of Medicine and entitled Chinese Restaurant Syndrome by an editor. And from that sprung thousands of letters of people writing in saying, yes, I have felt dizziness and headaches after eating in a Chinese restaurant myself. So, Chinese restaurant syndrome got its start as a disorder based on that simple, talkative letter to the editor. Why did it take this big springboard of all this research and then this very negative connotation of Chinese restaurant syndrome? And taking a deeper dive into history, it goes back to a certain amount of racism and anti Chinese sentiment in the latter half of the 19th century. And labor in the United States was threatened by the lower wages paid to Chinese miners, farmers, railroad workers, factory workers. And as a result, in 1882, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this act barred Chinese from becoming U.S. citizens and also restricted new immigration unless you were a Chinese business owner. Then in 1915, an exemption known as the lo mein loophole, and I love the term of that, the lo mein loophole, was enacted, and it allowed Chinese restaurants to qualify as Chinese businesses. And as a result, there was a big influx of Chinese immigrants who opened restaurants. The Exclusion Act itself was repealed in 1943, but during that time and persisting were lingering prejudices and xenophobia about Chinese culture and culinary adventures. Um, and one writer in an article entitled That Wonton Soup Headache, the Chinese Restaurant Syndrome, MSG, and the Making of American Food, he said as a result of a certain prejudice and the Exclusion Act, Asian culture and food was seen as bizarre and had excessive practices, was exotic, so that ultimately many of the researchers and scientists, those few studying the Chinese restaurant syndrome, very few of them questioned the ethnic origins of the condition. And I think it was some odd contradictions that resulted as well, because during that time, when Dr. Kwok published his letter, MSG as a food additive was used in everything, things like salad dressings and frozen foods. It was also very popular in Italian restaurants and American steakhouses. And when you think of the compound glutamate, which is the basis of MSG and provides that umami flavor, glutamate is very high in things like aged Parmesan cheese, and much cheese were used in Italian restaurants. Glutamate is also very high in things like beef. So if you went out for a steak, or any beef-based product in a restaurant, as well as cooking at home, you also got a lot of glutamate. So it was kind of contradictory of what happened too. Ending this on a positive note, though, is because glutamate MSG is involved in the flavor of umami. And umami has become a very, very recognized and popular flavor and a focus of chefs and cooks that were maybe turning the tide on perceptions of MSG.
Yes, absolutely. So it kind of begs the question then, when this letter got published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which again, it was not a scientific research study, it was a letter to the editor. And as editors do, they came up with a catchy title that really took hold. That spurred scientists to actually do some research. And can you talk a little bit about what that looked like? Were they well-designed studies? Did they find anything? They were looking at the side effects, quote unquote, of MSG causing headaches and all these other symptoms that people were reporting. Can you talk a little bit about what the research looked at and what the research showed?
Overall, the studies have shown that there is no consistent causative effect of MSG intake with negative side effects such as headaches. There have been large multi-center, double-blind, placebo-controlled, multiple challenge studies that showed there is no consistent or serious effects from eating MSG. And one study that I would cite is from Giha, which was published in the Journal of Nutrition in 2000. His study really refuted the aspect that MSG is causing headaches. As a matter of fact, the science is so strong that in January 2018, the International Headache Society removed MSG from its list of causative factors for headaches. Now, I think it's very important when we take a look at research, take a look at the full body of research and take a look at the weight of the evidence. And the weight of the evidence shows no causative effects. But people are right to ask, but what about these other studies that showed the opposite? When you take a harder look at those studies, you will find that for many of the rat studies, or actually all the rat studies, they were force-fed huge amounts of MSG that would never be replicated in the intake of what we eat in our diet every day. I think it's important that we critically analyze the studies. Were they well controlled? What was the sample size of the study? Was the data made available to other scientists so that they could assess and replicate the results? And those studies that showed the adverse effects were simply not very well done studies. As a matter of fact, probably in the past decade, there hasn't been a whole lot of research on MSG and negative side effects, simply because the vast body of information for 30 or 40 years overwhelmingly showed no negative side effects. And these were the well-done placebo-blinded studies.
Yes, that was very clear at the Umami Forum when they got into the science. I mean, we got into all aspects of umami that the research overwhelmingly shows that there is no connection. And yet, I think part of the controversy was the sort of negative label that was created when this letter was written and published in the New England Journal of Medicine. In fact, there are health professionals who believe that letter, they think it was a research study because it's just been so perpetuated. And so it's really important to point out that it was a letter to the editor.
Right. And, I also think it's important to point out, and I'm sure everybody who is listening to this podcast has heard, or maybe they themselves have experienced, oh, I never eat MSG, or my brother-in-law never eats MSG because it causes them headaches, or they get very dizzy, or they feel a little nauseous after eating it. I mean, a multitude of symptoms that have been described that are fairly negative. And when somebody says that to me, I really don't directly challenge them with it. I think it's important that we listen very, very carefully. And with MSG, just as with any other substance, there is something called the nocebo effect, which is like the placebo effect, where the suggestion of something negative actually causes a negative reaction. And just like the placebo effect, the nocebo effect symptoms are very real. When we're doing education about MSG, to directly challenge a contradictory statement does not get us anywhere. I think as registered dietitians, we first have to listen very carefully to what the person has to say about it. And if they have a sensitivity to it, that's fine. Developing a common conversation with them, talking about values, listening and hearing what they're saying, then at that point, we can talk about the scientific research. But to jump in and say, oh, no, you're wrong, and here's the research that proves it, I think is very challenging and really is not a good educational way of providing good research and information.
Right. Nobody wants to hear that they're wrong, and everybody's an expert in their own body and they know what their reactions are. But it's interesting because they may be having a reaction to something else. A lot of these studies, I believe, were looking at MSG like added to the diet, but not really isolating out if people were getting naturally occurring MSG. So could you talk a little bit about naturally occurring MSG in foods that you touched on a little bit versus adding MSG in the diet? And also, this isn't just about, oh, MSG is safe, it doesn't cause headaches. There's so much more to this. And I want to get into one of the most exciting things I think about MSG, and that's how it might actually help us reduce our sodium intake. So talk a little bit about naturally occurring versus added MSG.
Well, glutamic acid is one of the most endemic amino acids that occurs in nature. And it is a protein, as everyone knows. And in the body, in the form of glutamic acid, when a hydrogen is removed from it, it turns into glutamate. So the glutamic acid and the glutamate that is found naturally in foods, such as the Parmesan cheese and the beef I mentioned earlier, or in mushrooms or tomatoes, is exactly the same by the body in terms of its use. So there's no difference between glutamate that occurs naturally in food and the glutamate in MSG and how the body treats it.
Mm-hmm.
Glutamate is a very, very important substance. As a matter of fact, it plays a really important role in brain development, and it is involved in helping cognitive functions such as learning and memory, which I think we can all agree is pretty important. It also acts as a neurotransmitter, and it's the most abundant neurotransmitter in our nervous systems. About 90% of the synaptic connections in the human brain are formed by glutamate. So you can see it's a really important substance that we have in our body. And it works to transmit signals in the brain and throughout the nerves in the body. So that's why we know it's very important. Now, what happens when we add glutamate from MSG as opposed to getting it from naturally occurring sources? You've heard me say the body utilizes it the same way. So you can see it as equal in the body.
Mm-hmm.
And as a matter of fact, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology made the statement the human body does not distinguish between glutamate from foods or added MSG, and it metabolizes glutamate in the same manner. So that's from the safety part of it and the importance to the human body part of it. And you want to talk about how it could help improve diets, right?
Definitely.
Okay. Well, going back to my mom, she had that shaker of MSG, and she would sprinkle a little bit on the food as she cooked it, and it enhanced the umami flavor. So there's been research to take a look to see, could it actually help nutritionally? What are other benefits besides enhancing flavor? Well, the enhancing flavor component can be very important for people who have lost some of their sensitivity to taste, a vulnerable population like the elderly, for example. So there have been some research studies that have shown adding a small amount of MSG to the dishes of an elderly population enhance the taste and in measures increase their satiety or satisfaction of the food that they ate. And as a matter of fact, in a cohort or group of about 63 elderly who had clinical symptoms of malnutrition, adding MSG to their dishes increased their energy intake by about 10%. And in a group of elderly residents in a nursing home, added MSG increased their intake of things like entrees and soups and vegetables and decreased their intake of non-MSG containing dishes such as desserts. Now, in that latter group, it did not increase their energy intake overall, but it did increase their satisfaction of the food as well. So when we take a look at the flavor enhancer benefit for vulnerable populations such as the elderly, or perhaps for cancer patients who've lost their taste for eating food, it can actually increase the flavor and satisfaction of the taste of their food. You had mentioned sodium. Sodium is really high in our country. We all know that. And certainly for the registered dietitian audience listening to your podcast today, we know that our intake of sodium is around 3,400 milligrams each day. And that's an amount that is really significantly higher than the American Heart Association recommendations of 1,500 to 2,300 milligrams. And certainly, many other health organizations recommend lowering our sodium intake. MSG is the sodium salt of glutamate. So it does contain sodium, but only about a third of the amount of sodium as the table salt that we sprinkle on our food. And by substituting a small amount of MSG and adding a small amount of salt, we can reduce the sodium content of the dishes by 20 to 40% without sacrificing any flavor. I do have to tell you a story, personal here, about why people love salt. And when this whole issue of decreasing salt in the diet came about, I went out and I brought back a bag of low salt potato chips. Now, we all know potato chips cannot be classified as a health food, but it was something that I had as a small addition to our meal. And my husband took a potato chip and then he immediately picked up the salt shaker and sprinkled it with salt. So we have a natural taste.
Was that before or after he tasted it?
And that was after he tasted it, because we all know about husbands who will salt their foods before they taste it. You're absolutely right about that. But because people have a liking for salt, decreasing the salt decreases the flavor of foods for them. And so by adding a little MSG while we're decreasing the amount of salt, decreases the overall salt content of the dish, while at the same time maintaining the flavor of it. So I think that's a pretty important component there.
At the forum, we did a taste test. And one of the things, well, we tasted a lot of umami things, but we did this taste test where there was a vegetable, just a regular vegetable broth with sodium and a vegetable broth with MSG. And the vegetable broth with MSG had a lower total sodium content, but it tasted much better and much saltier than the vegetable broth that was higher in sodium. So I had the opportunity to taste that firsthand, and it was significantly different. The vegetable broth with sodium tasted like nothing. It tasted like it didn't have sodium in it. So that was really eye-opener.
Oh, it is. And I think there were about 500 people, or a little bit more than 500 people at that meeting. And from your observation, what do you think the rest of the people thought of the non MSG containing broth compared to the MSG containing broth?
Everyone at my table, because we had round tables, everyone at my table completely agreed. I mean, it was not a mild difference. It was shocking.
Well, and I think your listeners today can do their own little taste test there too by producing a dish, maybe something like scrambled eggs, one with MSG and one without, and offering it to their families and have it blinded, so to speak, and say, so which one do you think tastes better? Or
Mm-hmm.
do the same with broth. I had a similar experience myself with making vegetable soup. And I made this lovely vegetable soup. They had a lot of carrots and onions and garlic and green beans and green peas and zucchini. And I could not get a depth of flavor. I was serving it to some guests that we had coming from Mongolia. And Mongolians love their soup. So I was not about to feed them soup that did not taste particularly good. I wanted to showcase the best of what we had in the United States. So I added a teaspoon of MSG to this huge pot of soup. And amazing, it had such a depth of flavor. And it wasn't just enough from all the vegetables, which we knew tasted good and were healthy, but the taste profile completely changed. And that's where MSG can come in as a benefit, taste wise, and as we discussed earlier, while decreasing sodium at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did the scrambled eggs trick test, if you will, when I got home from the forum. And yeah, my family, I did a little like, okay, taste this one, taste that one. And they chose the one with a little bit of MSG too.
Oh, that's great and fun to do.
Mm-hmm.
A way of grabbing and getting nutrition information that is not a lecture, but really hands on and a good tasting way of doing it too.
Yeah, definitely. And there are other foods throughout the world that you can share some of the different types of foods that have the umami glutamate aspect.
Oh, surely. When people talk about umami, they think of things like soy sauce and adashi, very Asian products, obviously. In Vietnam, we have the fish sauce, which, because it is fermented and seafood already is high in glutamate, and the fermentation frees that glutamate out to get an even bigger boost of umami flavor.
Mm.
But it's around the world more than just the Asian condiments that provide the umami flavor. First of all, from our American food products, I mentioned beef, but also chicken, tomatoes, dried tomatoes, mushrooms, Parmesan cheese are naturally high in glutamate and umami flavor. Moving into the sauces from around the world, Worcestershire sauce, which is English, is a fermentation of anchovies, sugar, spices, and vinegar, very high in glutamate and the umami flavor. The Thai Golden Mountain sauce, dashi, which the Japanese use to make miso soup, sazon, which is a sauce that is used all over Latin America, Marmite in the United Kingdom and Australia is also a dish that contains a lot of glutamate. Japanese mayonnaise called Kewpie is very trendy,
Yes.
and that is really high in umami flavor and is flavored with MSG and vinegar.
I have to tell you, when I was at the meeting, the forum, and I found out that Kewpie mayonnaise had MSG in it, or, glutamate, I had this eureka moment because I love that stuff. And now I know why. I'm not a big mayonnaise person, but that was like an aha. That's why I think it's so much better. So I had that personal experience.
That's great. And I wonder how many people use Maggi sauce to make their gravy. And that is very popular in Asian countries, but it was developed in Switzerland.
Hmm.
So there are a lot of umami and MSG flavored dishes and sauces and condiments around the world that people don't even know contains MSG. So when they say, I stay away from MSG, in reality, they may not. And think of one of the most popular condiments in the United States, which is ketchup.
Mm-hmm.
Tomatoes in of themselves are very high in glutamate. And when you concentrate tomatoes, you get ketchup. And so very high in the umami flavor and glutamate. So I think it's fun when we tell people about umami and MSG to mention these things, that how universal this flavor profile of umami is and how popular it is and where we get it from.
Right. And I think when we would see the restaurants saying no MSG, or even food labels saying no MSG, where is that today? I haven't really seen that on food labels. I'm assuming you can look at a food label and look at the ingredients list and see if it says monosodium glutamate. But there's so many free from labels out there, like no gluten, no this, gluten-free, sodium-free, whatever. Are we seeing that still on the food labels, or is that kind of gone away?
Actually, I haven't seen a label that says contains no MSG or MSG free. In actuality and reality, I see it more in Chinese restaurant menus, though much less pervasive now than it was 30 years ago. I had mentioned very early in this podcast that my brother owned a Chinese restaurant, and it was the second largest Chinese restaurant on Long Island. It was called Golden Eagle. And when the information came out about MSG, his clientele and business went down about 20 to 30%, he said, and then slowly climbed back up. And to this day, unfortunately, you still see occasionally on Chinese restaurant meals, we do not use MSG. Or they might have a little phrase that said, if you don't want us to prepare the food with MSG, let us know. And to my mind, it perpetuates a stereotype that started from that letter to the New England Journal of Medicine that simply has not held up over the decades when we take a look at the research.
Right. And I wonder, do you see anything in the restaurants like no added MSG, or is it just MSG?
Just MSG, I think. And, I'm going to have to go out and take a harder look at menus. I do not usually go out to a large number of Chinese restaurants when we go out to eat because, quite honestly, I make really good Chinese food.
I bet.
And I do sprinkle in MSG.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm just thinking back. I can't remember the last time I saw that on a menu, but I'm sure it still persists to some extent. Before we sort of wrap up with MSG Umami, I have been dying to ask you and get you on the show and talk to you about industry funded research, because it's a question I ask a lot of my science related guests. So when it comes to industry-funded research, what do you hear from people, or what do you say to people when they criticize nutrition research that is funded by the food industry?
Well, I think research funded by food industry and businesses is very important. We need to have answers about our food, good and bad, and having that research is critical. But I know it is the age of skepticism now. So people ask, can we really trust industry funded research? And I say yes. And I say yes with the understanding that the research is very well done research, that it is very transparent when it's funded by industry. In this age of skepticism, I know that it's very important for scientific authorities and bodies to address that question so it provides reassurance to people in the healthcare community and to consumers. As a matter of fact, the National Academy of Sciences in 2017 issued a revision for their recommendations of making sure that research is well done and transparent. So, when we take a look at research and we see it may have been funded by businesses, then take a look. Is there an adherence to scientific processes? Is it valid and reliable procedures? Take a look at how the research is designed, executed, and analyzed. Is it published in a peer reviewed journal? And certainly, very important, is the data made available to other scientists and researchers so they can replicate it? And that's where we get the weight of the evidence. Taking just one most recent study and saying, oh, that's the answer, isn't going to provide the definitive answer. It's that replication of research that has been published in peer reviewed journals that provides the weight of the evidence and provides us with the information that we need. And really, scientists take great pride in their work. And to fool around with data is really going to come back and bite them.
Mm-hmm.
So, the scientists and researchers that I know take great pride in putting good data out. So, it needs to be very high quality and that we do that assessment to make sure we maintain the standards for research. And I think another area that we can take a look at to make sure we continue to provide very well done research is those private public collaborations and partnerships that are made to produce research. And that helps, again, further the credibility of the research that's out there, whether it's industry sponsored or not.
I always like to get the perspective on that. So thank you for putting that in your words and sharing your perspective on that. As we're wrapping up, you sort of spoke to this, but I wanted to make sure I give you the opportunity to really speak to this, is you have so much research and background and history with MSG. How do people react when they hear your thoughts on MSG? You talked earlier about if somebody says, oh, I have this reaction, you listen, but can you talk a little bit more about that? Do you get a welcome reception? Do you get, oh, that's very interesting? Or do you get the pushback?
I usually get a much positive reaction. I think having some credibility in explaining my history being Chinese, and I've been Chinese all my life, and explaining that how my mom uses it in her kitchen and how I use it in my kitchen goes to further that credibility. And then being a Western trained registered dietitian with an emphasis on using science based information for the data and education I provide is another piece of credibility. And as you mentioned, and we talked about earlier, really listening to the person and understanding what they're saying also elicits a very positive response even though it may not be a response that I particularly agree with. I'm not going to be in there judging them with my finger pointing at them and shaking my finger at them. The bottom line, I think, is being open to the information. Like you were open when you went to the summit and you had experiences, you had the opportunity to listen, and more importantly, question the people when they were providing you the information, can help change that attitude of stereotypes that are negative but certainly don't hold true when we take a harder look at it. And that is what I'm finding with MSG. With the emphasis of the importance of glutamate and the use of MSG and the interest in umami and flavors, and then that wealth of information that has been produced over the past 30 or 40 years, we're slowly changing that perception. It doesn't mean that I'm going to jump in somebody's face, though, and say, I don't believe you when you say you have a headache. It's providing the information for them and letting them process it and receiving information from them in a very open, caring way. Because when we talk about people's health, it's very personal and it's very important. And the best things we can do as registered dietitians is show that we care about what's important to them.
Absolutely. This topic interests me in a lot of different ways. And, first and foremost, I'm the guilt-free RD. Food shouldn't make you feel bad. I don't want people to have that fear factor that might be misguided. So first and foremost, the safety factor was of interest to me, but really became a game changer for me when I found out about how it can help enhance diets and reduce the sodium intake. And if people listening want to do this little scrambled egg challenge, you can make 2 batches of scrambled egg. Well, actually 1 batch of scrambled eggs, split them apart and use 1/4 of a teaspoon of MSG in your eggs and see how the flavor is different and do your own little taste test, maybe with your family members. So just in wrapping up, Mary Lee, what would you like to say about MSG, umami, the history, the background, and the takeaways for our listener?
Well, I hope your listeners enjoyed hearing about Chinese culture and heritage and its implication of how the stereotypes of headaches and MSG got started. I think that's a story that many people do not know. So I really appreciate the opportunity to get that out through your podcast. I'd like to provide some reassurance that it's not only me saying that MSG is safe to use, but every government body and testing system across the globe have given MSG a safety thumbs up. And lastly, because I'm a person who loves to eat and savors the taste of food, and I would guess that 100% of your audience falls into that category, I would encourage them to give MSG a try. Do that test we talked about with the scrambled eggs, or make a big pot of vegetable soup. And knowing that the vegetables in there already contain glutamate and the umami flavor, try adding a portion with a little bit more of MSG and do the taste test for yourself. I think you'll be very pleasantly surprised.
Absolutely. And that reminds me that I do have a lot of resources in the show notes at soundbitesrd.com. I've got fact sheets. I've got research resources. I have recipes. So if you're kind of like me and you're like, oh, I can't just shake a little bit of MSG on. I don't know how to use it. I don't know how much. And you need a specific recipe. We have all that for you. And also have how you can find Mary Lee on social media. On Twitter, she's at Mary Lee Chin. I've got websites, resources, all kinds of good stuff for you. So I encourage everybody to check those out in the show notes. And, you've mentioned the enjoyment of food. And so I just want to reiterate and emphasize that. That's why my tagline is sound science, smart nutrition, good food, because we really have to have all 3 pillars for that 3-legged stool. We can't really do without any one of those. We have to look at the whole picture. So thank you so much for being on the show, Mary Lee, and sharing all of this interesting background and science with us. And I look forward to seeing you hopefully at a meeting soon and staying in touch with you and all the great work you're doing.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today, too. I love it. And I'm going to send you my mom's recipe for beef, green pepper, tomatoes with salted black bean sauce, an umami blast.
Ooh, the umami bomb. Great. And can I share that in the show notes for everybody?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke.